Okay, good morning. We're going to continue our infectious diseases lecture. This is infectious diseases part 2. And we'll begin, of course, with review. This is the same background as the previous lecture. And using the knowledge you gained from that lecture, what do you think these particles are in the background? Do you think they're viral? Do you think they're virus particles? Or do you think they're bacteria? And of course, they are virus particles. And here's another example of a virus. Here's the Ebola virus photomicrograph that I showed you last time. As a review, let's review what are infectious diseases. Infectious diseases are disease conditions brought about by a microorganic organism that is both present and proliferating. As we discussed last time, to be an infectious disease, we have to have an organism present, and it must be both present and proliferating. There has to be an organism that has invaded the body, has overcome the body's immune system, or invaded the body in other manners. As we discussed last time, infectious diseases are not necessarily contagious. The adjective infectious does not mean contagious. The thing that makes a disease infectious is not whether or not we can spread it from person to person, not that it's contagious, but that it has an organism that is present. So infectious is not the same as contagious. To be an infectious disease, we must have an organism present. Typically that organism is microscopic. It's typically a microorganic organism, but to be infectious, we have to have an organism of some type present. Infectious is not the same as contagious. If we are dealing with infections, we can deal with communicable and non-communicable. So we're not even going to bring the word contagious into play here. We're going to deal with infections. An infection is a disease that is caused by an organism, not necessarily contagious or communicable. So there are communicable and non-communicable infectious diseases. Communicable diseases have the idea that the pathogen is spread typically from person to person. All right, and so that's what contagious means. Contagious is not necessarily just infectious. So we have different modes of transmission between persons to persons. We have airborne transmission, transported by coughing or sneezing. We have bloodborne. Remember, a bloodborne pathogen is spread by blood-to-blood contact. We had some of the bacterial infections that we discussed that were caused by different bacterial organisms that were spread by a vector, such as the deer tick for Lyme's disease, or the vector of fleas that was important in the bubonic plague. Contact, many diseases are spread by touching a contaminated surface. Foodborne, by ingesting contaminated food or water, or they can be an STD, a sexually transmitted communicable disease. Non-communicable diseases does not mean there's no organism, does not mean it's not infectious. It means that the individual must have direct contact with the pathogen. It's not typically spread from person to person. We need direct contact. These are your bloodborne pathogens and your foodborne pathogens. Last lecture we dealt with different infectious agents. We dealt with viruses and bacteria. Hopefully you understand the difference between the two. This lecture we're going to center in on fungus and protozoa and worms and other parasites. Of course, worms are not microorganic, but they are infectious agents. As a review, what are the conditions for an infection? What must occur before we can have an infection? The organism must be present, so that means it must penetrate the body's defenses, and it must proliferate. It must take hold and begin colonization. So with entry is typically barred by the skin. Most organisms cannot penetrate intact skin. The skin is our first line of defense. Very few organisms can penetrate it, and that's why typically an infection will enter through the mucosa. The mucosa, there's a mucous membrane that lines all of your organs internally, but also lines all of your body tracts, such as your respiratory system, your digestive system. Your urinary tract is included in that, and so is the linings of your eyelids. So once the organism has penetrated the body's barriers, it has either entered the skin or through one of the digestive or respiratory tracts, through the mucosa, then the organism has to be able to take hold and colonize in the body. And to do so, they must avoid the body's immune system, they must be able to attach and begin colonizing, and they must have access to the body's resources. Modes of pathogenicity, these are the same as with our viral infections and our bacterial infections. Modes of pathogenicity, this is how the organism causes symptoms. This is how the organism has disease symptoms with it. What does the organism actually do to cause problems to us? First of all, we can have an organism that causes immune response. We mentioned Streptococcus pyogenes causing fever. In fact, that's the name pyogenes, the species name of that organism. So many organisms will cause immune response, and sometimes the immune response itself can be dangerous to the person. Of course, if you have an infection, if you have a pathogen present or a parasite present, they will deprive your cells of the needed oxygen and nutrition. That's another mode of pathogenicity. That's another way that these organisms cause problems in the body. So mode of pathogenicity is the same general mechanisms, whether it's a viral infection, a bacterial infection, and now today a fungal infection, or a protozoa infection, such as protozoan infections would include malaria and some of your severe tropical fevers. All of these modes of pathogenicity are similar. These are just general mechanisms of how an organism causes disease. So we can cause an immune response, even an over-response by the host. We can deprive host cells, our own cells, the body's cells, of needed oxygen and nutrition. They can actively destroy body tissues. Many of your more dangerous or more virulent pathogens will actively destroy body tissues, and sometimes very quickly. Another dangerous mode of pathogenicity is the release of toxins. When you release toxins, these are compounds that the organism releases to the bloodstream or releases into the tissues that will cause various problems. Of toxins, the more severe are your neurotoxins. Remember the bacterial infection Clostridium botulism, that releases toxins. Another related species, Clostridium tetani, causes tetanus, and those are neurotoxins released by that organism, which causes paralysis. Inducement of cellular transformation, that of course is cancer, and that's pretty much typical of viruses. Why is that typical of viruses? Why not bacteria? And why not, in today's lecture, why not fungus and so forth? And that's because pretty much cancer is due to cellular transformation. It's due to abnormal cell division, which causes an accumulation of abnormal cells, and that is due to the virus injecting its own DNA or RNA into the host, taking over the host's replicative processes and causing abnormal cell division, and of course that can lead to cancer. So these are the modes of pathogenicity. A pathogen can cause an immune response. A pathogen can deprive cells of needed oxygen and nutrition. A pathogen can actively destroy body tissues. Some pathogens release toxins, and viruses in particular cause cellular transformation, which leads to cancer. Today's infectious agents are fungi and protozoans and worms or other parasites. Let's begin with fungi. Here we see another petri dish with fungal agents growing on it, and here you can see a photomicrograph, and this is fungus that you can see the different budding and so forth. This is a larger organism than both bacteria and obviously viruses. But this type of organism, these cells are larger and more complex. Fungi used to be in the plant kingdom. It's been separated into its own kingdom for various reasons. But what are fungi? What do we mean? What is a fungus? Fungi are a variety of different single or multicellular plant-like organisms. These are larger cells. These are not bacteria. They're completely different, much larger. They're going to have different modes of pathogenicity. They're going to have different routes of infection and so forth. So fungi, a variety of different types of some of them are single-celled, some of them are multicellular. They're more plant-like, consisting of larger cells. Examples, of course, when I say fungus, you think mushrooms, but well, there are some pathogenic mushrooms because they release toxins, but they're not a pathogen in the sense that we're talking today. But yeast and molds are more commonly the type of pathogens we want to deal with today. Structure of a fungus is filamentous, and you're going to see that in the next slide. But basically what a filament is composed of are repeating sections called hypha. And many of your bacterial or your fungal organisms will reproduce by spores. And it's the spores that can be inhaled and cause fungal infection of the lungs. So when we're dealing with fungi, we're dealing with filamentous structures. They're kind of more plant-like in appearance. And you can see here we've got different cells here. These are the cell nuclei, cell walls, and so forth. So here's our fungus. Pathogenicity of fungus. These, of course, are not nearly as common as bacterial infections or viral infections. And there are some similarities with bacterial infections. First of all, in the main route of infection is by the skin. Many skin infections themselves are fungal growths on the surface of the skin, but because of the fungal spore formation, that's how they reproduce, so you're going to have problems with respiratory infections when those spores are inhaled. With fungus, the main mode of pathogenicity is cell deprivation. The fungus is going to use up needed resources that the cells need, such as oxygen or nutrients. Another mode of pathogenicity can be cellular destruction. Fungal infections can destroy the surrounding tissues. With fungal infections, we have preventatives and treatments. First and foremost is cleanliness, but also important in fungal infections and even in some of your more communicable bacterial infections is the idea of isolation of infected persons. This is referred to as quarantine. And if you remember, the first practice of quarantine comes in the Bible. It's part of the Levitical law where lepers were isolated from the camp. And so this is a very important preventative of infectious diseases, particularly infectious diseases of the skin like fungal infections and infectious diseases that can affect the lungs when those spores are inhaled. You'll notice that one of the modes of infection you might have noticed in the last section for leprosy was respiratory. That's why in the Bible lepers were isolated. They even were made to wear cloths over their mouths and call out unclean, unclean. So that is the practice of quarantine. It is most commonly practiced today with fungal infections. So the isolation of infected persons, and of course cleanliness is a big part of the preventative for fungal infections. Treatments. Because fungi are cells, we can treat them with antibiotics, but most of our fungal infections that we will deal with are skin infections, and so they will be treated with antifungals that are topical, creams and ointments that are applied to the skin. So fungal infections, typically the ones that we come in contact with, are they're less dangerous. They're skin infections. They are due to uncleanliness, or even they've been passed in the nursery from children, from different child to child, or in daycare and so forth. and they're not severe infections that we see with viruses. And so we will treat them with topical antifungal creams. Severe and respiratory type fungal infections will be treated with antibiotics. Let's do some specific examples of fungal infections. Again, most of our fungal infections are of the skin, fingernails and toenails, and so forth. You've probably heard of ringworm. Ringworm is a fungal infection. It's not a worm. It's caused by this fungal organism, Tinea corpus. And of course, it's going to affect the skin, and it does grow in a classic ring shape. Kind of looks like it could be a worm, so that's why it's called ringworm, but it is a fungal infection. Another common fungal infection is toenail fungus. And this is the same genus name, so very similar organism causing fungal infection of the toenails. And of course, this can be very difficult to treat, and often this type of infection will not go away without antibiotics or some type of oral antifungal. Then we have athlete's foot. Athlete's foot is another type of skin infection that is caused by a very similar organism, same genus, different species. And you can see Tinea pedis because it's found on the foot. So a lot of our skin infections that we commonly see, these are preventable by cleanliness and also isolation of the infected person or isolation of the infected part of the body. Yeast infections are next. Yeast infections are fungal. Here's the causative organism, Candida, and one of the more common ones, oral yeast infection, commonly called thrush. You can see a photomicrograph of that yeast organism. Lung infections, though, are also fungal. There are some serious fungal infections due to the inhalation of the fungal spores. One such disease is histoplasmosis, caused by this fungal organism, and this is a disease of the lungs due to inhalation of the spores. It's going to cause tissue damage in lung tissue, immune response in the lungs, and so forth. So there are serious fungal infections of the lung. There's another one. This one often happens to people who are HIV positive because their immune system is compromised. And you can see here we have this fungal organism in lung tissue. So that's the third infectious agent. That is the, we have viral infections, we have bacterial infections, and now fungal infections. Moving on to the fourth type of infectious agent, those are protozoa. Protozoa. These are more complex, larger, single-celled organisms. Here's a typical protozoan, and you can see it kind of reminds us of the bacillus that we saw in the previous lecture, but it is much larger. It is a more complex cell. Bacteria, they are smaller, they are simpler. They're called prokaryotic cells. They don't have distinct nuclei that contains their DNA. They don't have near the complex organelles and structures within themselves that what are called eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells, such as protozoans, all of our cells are typical. Your typical cell is a eukaryotic cell. These are the larger cells. These cells all have a nucleus. These cells all have a plasma membrane. Some have cell walls, some do not. They all have a very highly organized cytoplasm. You can see with all these organelles inside. And so this is a larger, more complex, but it is a single-celled organism. There's the nucleus. You can see we've got the flagella, very common structure to allow this animal. It used to be protozoans were classified in the animal kingdom. It's more animal-like. So this allows the protozoan. You can see the name here of this group is actually very evolutionary. Proto meaning first. So this name literally means first animals. And they were initially classified in the animal kingdom, and they are motile, they are animal-like, but they certainly are not the first animals to have evolved. They're just simply a different type of organism. And you can see many of these organisms will be motile, so they have a flagellum to propel themselves through fluids and so forth, and a much more complex structure. So we have viruses. What are viruses? They are very tiny, tiny, tiny. They're subcellular. They're not living cells. They are intracellular parasites that have to inject themselves into a cell. They don't have any of the structures necessary for life. Then we had the bacteria. Bacteria are very small cells, very simple cells. They are not eukaryotic like the protozoa we're dealing with now. They live in colonies, and they are going to grow and colonize on different tissues. Then we had fungus. Fungus is eukaryotic, a larger, more complex cell. But if we want to contrast fungus with protozoa, we are going to notice that fungus is more plant-like. It kind of grows and looks like a plant, whereas protozoa are more animal-like. They're going to be motile. They're going to have these structures like the flagellum that allows them to move and propel themselves, typically through fluids. So our fourth pathogen, our fourth infectious agent, is the protozoa. And with this type of pathogen, mode of pathogenicity, protozoans are more dangerous as parasites. In fact, they're probably more closely called parasites than fungus. Because they are animal-like, because they are larger and more complex cells, they can commonly be called parasites rather than just infectious agents. So your protozoa will cause problems by actively destroying cells and tissues. So we have cell and tissue destruction. And another characteristic here of protozoa infections is because these are parasites and because they are larger, more complex organisms, they are more like a parasite than just a disease. And so they are going to cause a massive immune response. And many times the immune response is very dangerous to the host. And most of these protozoans they're not going to be spread through airborne transmission. Why? They're too large. Airborne transmission is for viruses and bacteria that can be in the droplets of someone's sneeze or cough. And so the mode of transmission or the route of infection is going to be different because these are different organisms. They are larger and more complex. Most of these infections or most of these parasites will enter the body through the blood or through contaminated food and water. And so if it is a blood-borne pathogen, it's going to be spread by blood-to-blood contact. And primarily that's going to involve, with these diseases, it's going to involve a vector. It's going to be spread by an insect bite. The insect will carry the organism, and then as it goes from person to person and bites different hosts, that's how the parasite enters the bloodstream of the host. So most of these infections are primarily bloodborne, and there's going to be spread by a particular insect, a particular vector that will carry the organism from person to person and transmit them through a bite. But also many types of protozoa infections can be ingested in contaminated food and particularly contaminated water. When we're dealing with protozoans, we have these things in mind. Preventatives. The most important preventative for your protozoan infections, because they are bloodborne, they do require an insect bite, so the logical thing to do is to avoid the vector and to use insecticides and so forth. So we want to avoid the vector. One of the most prevalent diseases in the world, worldwide, is malaria, and malaria is a protozoa infection. The malaria parasite is a particular type of protozoan. And so with malaria, the main preventative is to avoid the vector. And of course, we can have vaccinations against protozoa infections. Treatments for these diseases, and they are dangerous diseases, often involve highly toxic drugs, and it's kind of a balance to get rid of the organism without killing the host. So protozoa infections typically are bloodborne, typically are carried by some type of insect that acts as a vector, and the treatment can be quite extensive because the drugs that are needed are highly toxic, and we have to balance the toxicity to the host, to the person, with the need to eliminate the parasite. Particular examples, I'm going to begin with amoebic dysentery. Amoebic dysentery is foodborne, although this is typically contracted through drinking of contaminated water, but also can be ingested on contaminated produce. Amoeba is a very common protozoan. It's a single-celled organism, and it's known for its amoeboid motion, where it sends out streams of cytoplasm called a pseudopod, and then kind of inches its way along. So there are amoebas that can enter a person, typically through, like I said, contaminated water, possibly contaminated fruit or produce. And here's a picture of that. Here's a diagram of it. And the most severe type of amoeba infection is called amoebic dysentery. Dysentery has the idea of severe diarrhea and even damage to the person's colon. So amoebic dysentery, this is one of the most dangerous and one of the few foodborne protozoa infections. So this does not require a vector, and it will be ingested on food or water. And here again is the idea of infection. What are the two conditions that have to occur for an organism to cause an infection? Remember, it has to be both present and proliferating. So what does this infection involve? It involves ingestion on contaminated food. That's the means by which this organism is present in the host. Then it has to proliferate, and amoebas will colonize on the intestinal walls. The amoeba will invade and destroy intestinal mucosa, and it's going to actually be able to form cysts and survive in the gut of the host over long periods of time. So amoebic dysentery, very severe types of diarrhea because it is going to invade and destroy the intestinal mucosa. Here are the symptoms: intestinal dysentery and colitis. Colitis means inflammation of the colon, causes lesions in the colon, and very severe and bloody diarrhea. It can also, remember, the amoeba is mobile. It has those pseudopods. It's able to move around. It can migrate to the lungs and liver and form abscesses in the lungs and the liver, and even other places of the body. So amoebic dysentery is our primary example of a foodborne protozoan infection. Then the next few are going to be bloodborne protozoa infections, where the parasite will be transmitted directly to the bloodstream by an insect bite. You've probably heard of this. First one, African sleeping sickness. African sleeping sickness is a severe form of meningoencephalitis. So we've got an infection of the meninges. That's the protective covering of the brain, and it's going to cause inflammation around the brain. That's encephalitis. So meningoencephalitis, beginning with an inflammation of the meninges surrounding the brain, and then severe inflammation around the brain. Of course, your main symptoms here are going to be beginning with headache, severe headache, dizziness, and then, of course, progressing to coma and death. This is a very virulent type of disease. And so you can see here are the actual parasites and the organism involved. Here you see it has a very complex life cycle. It's going to begin its life cycle in the vector, and then the organism here is with different types, and of course it's called African sleeping sickness because it's endemic in parts of Africa. This is caused by the tsetse fly, the African tsetse fly. The organism involved kind of depends on which region of Africa you're dealing with, And with African sleeping sickness, it's going to be spread by the African tsetse fly and actually passed to the host through the insect's saliva when the insect bites. Begins with an ulcer at the bite site, and then it progresses to severe fevers and headaches, paralysis, coma, and death. African sleeping sickness. Malaria. I mentioned that malaria is the #1 infectious disease worldwide. So we're going to spend some time here talking about malaria. I want you to be familiar with malaria itself. You need to know the causative agent. You need to know the particular vector involved. You need to know the symptoms and so forth, because malaria is the #1 killer of people worldwide. So a very important, widespread disease. You can see the organism. This is the genus name, Plasmodia. And there's different strains of malaria caused by different organisms. On all of these, you can see Plasmodium, Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium falciparum. These are different malaria species. So you need to be able to tell me that the causative organism of malaria is Plasmodia. It can be Plasmodium vivax. If the fever bouts occur every 48 hours, it would be Plasmodium malariae. If the bouts of fever last 72 hours, and then the shorter bouts of fever and chills, which characterize the malaria infection, is caused by Plasmodium falciparum. There's the vector. In this case, it is the Anopheles mosquito, not just any mosquito, this particular breed of mosquito. And then you can see a photomicrograph. You'll notice that the organism is infecting red blood cells and destroying red blood cells, bringing about the bouts of chills and fever, causing severe anemia. Malaria, the disease malaria itself, kills more people worldwide than absolutely anything else, including all forms of cancer, including AIDS, including even things that aren't diseases, including famine, including genocide that may be the result of wars in Africa, including all causes of death. And of course, you can see malaria is centered in Africa, also South Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, and there are some forms of it found in South America. So this is the world distribution of malaria in 2014, and still malaria kills more people worldwide than anything else. All of your diseases, all of the homicide, and so forth. So malaria is something that you need to know. I'm going to back up here again to the organisms. The organism that causes malaria is not a virus, it's not bacteria, it is a protozoan. And again, what is a protozoan? It is a single-celled organism, but is a larger organism. It is a more complex cell. It's not bacteria. Bacteria is protozoan. It's not a protozoan. Bacteria is prokaryotic. It is not the same type of cell. A Plasmodium organism is a protozoan. It is a larger eukaryotic cell. So it is not viral, it's not bacterial, it's not fungal. It is a particular category of its own. It's in the Plasmodia organism. It's caused by the Plasmodia organism, and it is a protozoan. It's in the protozoan category. And it is a very important worldwide disease. Route of infection and the symptoms. We'll begin with the route of infection. The route of infection, because this is a blood-borne pathogen, it requires blood-to-blood contact, and that contact occurs through an insect bite. There is the particular mosquito type that carries the malaria organism, and only this type of mosquito, because the malaria organism has a very specific life cycle, part of which will occur in the insect, and then it'll be spread to its primary host, which can be people or other animals, such as a lot of cattle and so forth. So there's the vector, the Anopheles mosquito. Symptoms are very characteristic of malaria. You need to know that malaria is characterized by regular bouts of chills, fever, and sweating. If we go back to our initial malaria slide here, you can see that that's how the organism is initially identified, is by the length of the bouts of chills, fever, and so forth. And so there's different organisms involved, different species of Plasmodia. All of them will cause these characteristic symptoms of regular bouts of chills, fever, and sweating. And then the fever subsides and the symptoms abate, and the person appears to recover, and then they will have a recurrent attack within a matter of weeks. That's another characteristic of malaria. You're going to have these bouts of chills and fever, and they're going to recur every so many weeks. And then the malaria organism, the Plasmodia, can become latent in the host and then be present. The symptoms subside. The person no longer has the bouts of chills and fever on a recurrent basis, and then years later the malaria can resurface. Symptoms of malaria begin with headache. The primary symptoms are the chills and the sweating, and then you have the muscle aches and back pain and so forth. Many persons also have nausea and have symptoms of vomiting. You'll notice here we've got enlargement of the spleen. The spleen in the body functions as the blood reservoir. And so because the malaria organism attacks the red blood cells, the spleen becomes involved in a malaria infection. Here's the life cycle. Here's the life cycle of the Plasmodia species that accounts for the characteristic symptoms. You can see we'll begin here with the vector, the Anopheles mosquito. We're going to have the mosquito bite. The organism will be in the saliva of the mosquito. You can see transmission to humans. It's going to inject sporozoites. These are the spore form, the kind of encapsulated form of the malaria organism, and it's going to inject that into the host. The host is going to enter some of the livers and so forth, reproduce in the liver. Then it's going to attack the red blood cell. Here's part of the life cycle in the red blood cell, and then it will be latent in the human's red blood cell. Then the mosquito could possibly bite an infected person, and then the organism will live in the insect, in the vector, and then the cycle begins again. The main part of the symptoms of malaria, which include anemia, include those regular bouts of chill and fever, are due to the fact that the primary target of the malaria organism is the red blood cell. With malaria, the biggest thing that needs to be done, of course, remember when we talked about protozoa infections in general, the main preventative is to avoid the vector. So what needs to be done to prevent malaria is to eliminate the Anopheles mosquito population, because malaria can only be spread through this mosquito bite. Part of the mosquito, or part of the organism's life cycle, is particular to the mosquito. And so if we're going to have control of this disease, we need to eliminate the vector, because a big part of the life cycle here does involve the mosquito. And so we've got the life cycle here involving this whole part of the life cycle is in the Anopheles mosquito. So preventative involves control of the mosquito population. There's a big controversy about DDT, which is banned essentially worldwide, and so we've had problems with malaria ever since. Treatment. The treatment of malaria is very famous. Quinine. There's a story of how this was discovered, and now many of the treatments of malaria are directly related to quinine, and they're artificially produced and altered manufactured forms of quinine. So quinine is the treatment and of course its related forms. So with malaria you need to know the causative organism, Plasmodium, and you need to be familiar with how it's transmitted through the insect bite of the Anopheles mosquito. You need to remember that its primary target is the red blood cell, so it's going to cause those bouts of chills and fevers. It's going to cause anemia in the long term. It is also the #1 killer worldwide, primarily centered in Sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit of South America, and Southeast Asia. It's spread through an insect bite of the Anopheles mosquito, and its symptoms are characteristic. What are the symptoms of malaria? Regular bouts of chills and fever. These are recurring bouts of chills, fever, sweats, and even a general form of what's called malaise. Just don't feel well, you've got muscle aches, and so forth. And then these can recur later. And the life cycle of the mosquito requires time in the life cycle of the parasite, of the malaria organism, Plasmodia. The life cycle here involves a big portion of it in the mosquito, in the Anopheles mosquito. So my Plasmodia's life cycle is in the mosquito, then it will be injected into human beings, starting in the liver, and then this other part of its life cycle, its primary target being the red blood cell. Preventatives: control the mosquito population. Treatment: quinine, and now manufactured artificial forms of quinine. So malaria, probably the most infamous protozoan infection. Next, we're going to complete infectious diseases with studying parasites. Parasites, most parasites are worms. What are worms? They're very large, veriform. That's just a fancy way of saying worm-like animals. Most of our parasitic worms will be flatworms or roundworms. Here's a flatworm. Here's an example of a roundworm. By flat and round, we're talking about diameter. Flatworms are very flat. Roundworms are very cylindrical or round. With worms, their mode of pathogenicity can be severe because they are much larger, more invasive parasites, and they're going to deprive the host of nutrients in particular, because most of your parasites, your worms, will enter the host through the digestive tract, take up residence in the digestive tract, and so the main mode of pathogenicity is to deprive the host of nutrients. But as they are taking up residence in the host, we'll have cell destruction and, of course, immune response to all of that. Route of infection I just mentioned. Worms are going to be ingested in contaminated food, and many times when we're dealing with a parasitic worm, we're going to be dealing with what's called an intestinal infestation rather than an infection, because these are larger organisms, and the mode of infection is through contaminated food. We're not dealing with transmission in the traditional sense, so it is called an intestinal infestation. Here's an example of a worm in stomach. Treatments and preventatives. Because we're dealing with a foodborne illness, we're dealing with sanitation, and we need adequate disposal of contaminated water, and we need adequate sewage treatment and sewage removal. Many times these types of infestations are in your third world countries that simply lack adequate sewage removal and sewage treatment. So sanitation is a very important part of eliminating parasites, parasitic worms. This is something that we don't worry about in the United States because we have adequate sewage treatment, sewage removal, and that type of sanitation. And so many of this is going to be transmitted, many of these worms will be transmitted through feces, and then when you have contamination of produce in particular through such things, you're going to have problems with intestinal worms. And then, of course, another thing that plays a role is the proper handling of the food, but then the proper cooking of the food, particularly cooking of your red meats. because not only do these worms take up residence in the digestive system of the host, they can also burrow into and take up residence in muscle tissue. So the thorough cooking of meats, in particular pork, is very important to prevent a worm infestation. Once you have this worm infestation, treatments can be very severe because this is a large organism, and we're going to have to take very highly toxic drugs and even have the worm removed surgically. So these are worm infestations. Tapeworm is a common worm infestation. Tapeworm, because these little segments, it's a segmented worm, these little segments can break off. And you'll notice this tapeworm has a structure called the scolex that enables the worm to attach to the intestinal wall and start causing problems, start taking up nutrition from the host, start growing, and so forth. Tapeworm is usually ingested on contaminated beef, pork, or fish. That's why sanitation, sewage treatment and removal is so important, food handling is so important, and proper cooking of meats is important. And most people are only infested by one very large tapeworm. And the symptoms are very severe, and often a person with a tapeworm will be treated surgically. Next, roundworm. Trichinosis is a common roundworm that causes an infestation. And then elephantitis involves this particular worm, and it's called elephantitis because these worms take up residence in the lymphatic tissues, in the lymph vessels, and cause the person to retain water because we can't return tissue fluids back to the circulatory system, and so we get this grotesque swelling of the lower extremities, referred to commonly as elephantitis, because it almost looks like the person's got the short, stubby legs of an elephant. Very serious disease. So that concludes the 5 infectious agents. You need to be familiar with what each of those organisms are, things involving their structure, their mode of pathogenicity, their preventatives, and their treatments. So all of these are infectious diseases because we have an organism present. Most of those organisms are microorganic, but they can also be the very large parasitic worms. There's the 5 infectious agents. Viruses. What are viruses? Remember, viruses are small, they're subcellular, they're smaller than a cell. They're intracellular parasites that will infect a target cell. What's an example of a virus? Again, think of your vaccinations. You have the viruses that we highlighted in class. You have your handout with even more different types of viruses and the infection that they cause. A type of virus you could think of would be HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. That's an easy and an obvious one to know. Eventually causes AIDS. Another viral infection would be hepatitis, in particular hepatitis B. Then we have bacteria. What are bacteria? Bacteria are small cells. They're prokaryotic cells. They're not as complex as the cells that make up our bodies. They're not as complex as the cells that make up fungus. They're not as complex as the cells that make up Plasmodia, for example, the malaria organism, or other protozoans. But they grow in colonies. You need to know those 3 shapes, the cocci, the bacillus, and the spirilla, the spiral-shaped, and a few bacterial infections. You're probably familiar with strep throat. That's Streptococcus pyogenes. It causes strep throat. You might be familiar with having a boil, which is Staphylococcus aureus. You might have been interested in anthrax, which is Bacillus anthracus. So you need to know what these infectious agents are, examples of infections that they cause, and the problems that they cause, which we're calling the mode of pathogenicity. Today we covered fungus. Fungus are larger. Fungus involves a eukaryotic cell. So fungi are larger, more plant-like organisms, and they are going to typically be skin infections. So when you think about skin infections, you need to think fungus. Ringworm. toenail fungus. All of those things are due to lack of cleanliness and so forth, and they are fungal infections. Protozoa, when you think of a protozoa infection, you need to think of severe, maybe what we'd call tropical fevers, such as malaria and African sleeping sickness. You need to know malaria in detail. You need to know that malaria is caused by a protozoan. It's caused by the Plasmodia species, different ones depending on the length of the bouts of chills and fever. Malaria is very characteristic. It has those regular and recurring bouts of fever, chills, sweating, and then a general feeling of malaise, tiredness, and achiness. And then that disease can recur years and years later. Protozoan infections. Then the last thing we did was worms. And of course, worms cause what we call infestations. They're very large, they're animals, and they're going to cause disease primarily of the digestive tract because they're going to be ingested on contaminated food, particularly contaminated meats. And for each one of these three that we highlighted today, you do need to know their preventatives and their treatments. If you think about fungus, you need to think about things like athlete's foot. That is a fungus, and it's treated with topical antifungals or even oral antibiotics if it becomes severe. And of course, the preventative is to isolate the fungus, isolate the person that has the infection, isolate the part of their body that has the actual ringworm or whatever we're dealing with. And then protozoans. Protozoans are also eukaryotic cells. They're also larger, more complex. They're more animal-like. They're going to be single-celled. Examples are the amoeba. Particular types of amoebas can cause that amoebic dysentery, or the other types of protozoans include the plasmodia that are bloodborne, carried through a mosquito, or the tsetse fly for African sleeping sickness. Those are called vectors. And last, we have the parasitic worms that will be ingested. So preventatives, of course, proper food handling and sanitation, and thorough cooking of meat will help prevent many of your worm infestations. So we're going to conclude then our lectures on infectious diseases and our 5 infectious agents. Here's a final kind of picture to leave you with of a worm infestation.